How neat, simple it is.
Yeah.
And you make this thing that you said, oh, it's such a simple thing. I can bring in 50 doctors who believe it.
I was reading this,
right? I mean, there are doctors who believe
this
it.
morning I went to the Zyprexa site. Zyprexa, it's not the company, Zyprexa has its own website. And it was right there. Schizophrenia is caused by a chemical imbalance in neurotransmitters, and Zyprexa corrects it. It's right there.
They know that's a lie. If you actually, now today, because we've got a lot of research now since they floated this in the 70s. If you call up a researcher from Eli Lilly, and let's say you're a journalist and do this, they will start out with that story. They'll say, oh, well, it's like insulin for diabetes, it corrects an imbalance. And you'll say, well, no, it doesn't. It blocks, you've done your research of what's sent to the FDA, and you'll say, no, it blocks these neurotransmitters profoundly. That's not balancing anything. And they say, oh, well, that's true. So the guys at Eli Lilly will back away from that in 2 seconds. Because they know it's not true. They'll back away from the chemical balance story. And you'll say to the Eli Lilly guy, what's the evidence for it? And the Eli Lilly guy will be honest, we don't have it. I think as it's originally floated, it's an honest hypothesis. Maybe I'm wrong on that. But when it's first floated, it seems like, even though there's plenty of reasons to doubt it, that there is some integrity to it. Okay? It's honestly a hypothesis. But basically, by the time of 79, 80, and they've investigated it, they have reason to think it's not, that story is not very accurate. By 92, they know it's not accurate. And that's the moment it moves from maybe a flimsy hypothesis to, when they keep on saying it, to where it's fraud because they know it's not really true. By 92, 94, etc. They know, and if you, for example, if you read in Science magazine today, January 17th, 2003, the guy's very much behind the biological story. They ask him, what causes schizophrenia? And they answer, we don't have the slightest idea. Okay, and these are biological guys, etc. So we know that's not true today. When Warren's doing Soteria House, it's still something of a viable hypothesis. People somewhat believing in it. So that's one thing. Now, the second thing is outcomes. So Warren gets good outcomes with his, but it's not like they don't think they're getting good outcomes with their drugs.
But if you don't need the drugs to get the good outcomes, it can't be correcting the chemical, that can't be the mechanism for that's causing the problem in the first place, because you didn't correct any chemical imbalance.
Well, the question is, what researchers know among themselves in terms of what the drugs do, and what might be a cause of schizophrenia, etc. So you go to the Zyprexa.com website and it says Zyprexa fixes a chemical imbalance, okay? So that's one story out there. But now I go to Science magazine, okay, which is a story that they're telling among themselves, and we're talking biological guys, Steve Hyman, Carol Domingue, etc. And Science journalist says, what causes schizophrenia? And they respond, we don't have the slightest idea. That's January 17th, 2003. So I think the precise thing is the mechanisms are totally unknown. So that's the story, and that's an accurate story, I think.
So this description at the Zyprexa website about how
it's a marketing thing.
The people who are doing the research could not in any way support those kinds of statements.
Absolutely not. And I asked a guy from Janssen, which makes risperidone, why do you make these statements? It's like insulin for diabetes. He says, well, it gets people to take their drugs. It's a story that they can understand. That's what they tell you. And I said, so it's not real? They said, no, of course not. We know it's much more complicated, etc. But it's a way to get people to take their drugs. This is a guy, for example, that was big in risperidone research. In fact, he was the top guy. And now he says, you can't use that. He starts screaming at me. He says, you can't use that. But at that point in the interview, he's saying, no, it's a simplistic story. They know there's a game going on. They all back down. You do the interviews as a journalist. Here's what happens. They all say it's like insulin for diabetes. Then you say, well, no, it's not. No, you say, what's the evidence for that? And very quickly they say, okay, it's just a metaphor to get people to take their drugs. That happens all the time when you do interviews like this.
But this guy who's telling you that it's a good way to get people to take their medication, this story, this fairy tale that they're writing, inventing, he doesn't feel that there's any obligation to tell the truth then.
No, because he believes the drugs are good, or at least so that they are effective.
Well, okay, now we get to that point, then how do we go back to Lauren's research that shows that without drugs we can have better outcomes, and we haven't even talked today about the damaging side effects of these drugs, the serious damaging side effects.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, the thing is, it's not just Lauren's study, okay? First of all, Lauren replicates it, but it's not just one isolated study.
The WHO data, too.
Well, there's the WHO data. There were two other studies in the 1970s. You mentioned one that started in '69, Rappaport study. Okay, here's how compelling it is. First of all, there's 3 studies of this sort, in generally that I could find, NIMH funded in the 1970s, that took newly diagnosed patients and either put them on standard drug care or some sort of experimental form of care. So Thierry House was one. Rappaport and the one your wife was talking about the other night, Will Carpenter's study. In those 3 studies, each time the relapse rates, which is the rehospitalization, or however you're going to define relapse, okay, but generally, return of psychotic symptoms, etc., to some level. Each time on that target symptom, so we're looking at, this is the target symptom that the drugs are supposed to improve.
The most important
It's
criteria.
it's the reason for the drug
Right.
taking. And each of those 3 studies, the relapse rates were higher for the drug-treated group. So it's not just Lauren's study here that you got to ask why they didn't pay attention to. And again, we're talking about a target symptom. Now let's even go back in the 1960s, the first NIMH study that launched this whole revolution. It's like a 9-hospital study. It's, I think, published in '63 roughly. At 6 weeks, they say, you know the study. The drug-treated patients are doing better.
Who paid for this study?
This is NIMH.
Okay.
Okay. So we've actually got 4 arms. Okay. We've got 3 drug-treated groups with a neuroleptic and a placebo arm. And after 6 weeks, they say the drug-treated groups are doing better. Okay, by whatever their outcome variable is. And this actually is the moment that the drugs, in my mind, where they talk about the drugs differently. They're no longer tranquilizers. They even say this in the report. They're anti-schizophrenic in kind. So we're moving drugs that came into use for retarding motor movement. That's the moment. And they say this. They're not tranquilizers. They're anti-schizophrenic in kind. But what happens a year later when they come back? The relapse rates, the hospitalization rates are highest for the 3 drug-treated groups. So that's also telling us on the target symptom that something's going on with those drug-treated patients that's causing some biological change that's increasing their vulnerability to relapse over time. So all I'm trying to add here to this conversation is it's not just Lauren's study that has to be ignored. There's a body of evidence.
Right.
And then the WHO evidence comes in. That adds to it. There was who was the guy who replicated your study in Switzerland? Chompy does his Soteria House in Switzerland, and he writes surprisingly. So in other words, if he has a bias, it's still towards the drugs. Surprisingly, those patients who received no or very little medication had significantly superior results. So it keeps adding up, and I think the point is, it's not just one study, but it's something that repeats from all these different angles. And now you have to ask the question, why is it ignored?